Vladimir Putin is afraid. Russia's president would never show it, of course. He's far too concerned about maintaining the strongman image that has served him so well as the leader of his country. But behind the scenes, Putin's paranoia has led to him making some crazy moves that stretch beyond mere self-preservation. You can take the man out of the KGB, it seems, but you can't take the KGB out of the man. And right now, Putin is terrified of one thing: Ukrainian drones that can reach Moscow. Putin fears death is coming as Ukrainian drones zero in for the kill, and he's come up with a remarkably convoluted solution to the problem. The solution, United 24 media reported on November 12th, is to create a series of offices across Russia. On its own, that wouldn't seem strange. Leaders the world over need access to offices across their countries so they can quickly respond when situations arise. The difference between those types of situation rooms and Putin's offices is simple. The Russian leader's offices are practically identical. Why? Because Putin never wants anybody to know where he really is at any given time. United 24 media says that the discovery of Putin's identical offices was made by an investigative outlet named Sistema, which worked alongside Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Current Time to find out what Putin is doing. According to Sistema, Putin's offices are informally called Beige Rooms, and they're designed to exacting standards so that Russia's leader has full control over them at all times. The outlet says that it's discovered at least 3 of these beige rooms during its investigation, and notes that there are several clues to look for when snooping for one of Putin's identical offices. Door handles, decorative lines, and even folders are among those clues, as you'll find out in a moment when we explain how Sistema discovered the existence of the fake offices. United 24 media adds more, stating that the beige rooms all have the exact same layout, wall paneling, and furniture. To the uninformed observer, these 3 offices would all appear to be one, and that is what Putin is counting on. He's created these offices so that official footage released from these meetings makes it appear as though he's always in the same place. He isn't. Based on Sistema's findings, Putin could at any given time be in an office that is in Sochi, Valdai, or Novo-Ogaryovo. You would never know which based on official pictures. That is by design. But if these offices are so identical down to minor details like the number of pencils placed on a table, how did Sistema even discover that they existed in the first place? Sistema explained its method. The organization looked at hundreds of publications involving Putin and his officers over the last decade, including dozens of hours of footage shot as part of the Moscow Kremlin-Putin TV program. With the footage and photos compiled, what followed was untold hours of painstaking detective work. The investigative organization examined official government procurement documents and building plans to determine that there were several of the exact same design of office built in Russia. It also looked into the travel records of Russian state media journalists to discover where they were and why, allowing the organization to put together even more pieces. It's through this detailed examination that Sistema started to spot inconsistencies. The original office, upon which the other 2 are based, is located in Novo-Ogaryovo. It's also in this location that Putin claims to be whenever he allows the release of footage of him or his cronies working in his supposed main office. However, the first hint Sistema discovered of the forgeries existing takes us back to December 2020. On that date, the host of Moscow Kremlin-Putin, Pavel Zarubin, stood outside what was supposed to be Novo-Ogaryovo. Tugging lightly at the door handle, Zarubin said, "It's reasonable to assume that a significant portion of the preparation for the press conference took place in this very room." Perhaps it was reasonable to assume that, but the assumption would be wrong. The next shot of the program shows Putin tugging at what was supposed to be the same handle. Both the original shot and the footage of Putin are labeled as being from Novo-Ogaryovo, which the Kremlin reinforces to leave viewers with no doubt about where Putin is located. It's also clear that Russian state TV wanted people to believe that the reporter and Putin were in the same building at the same time, with the footage being captured having been shot live. However, the door handles that the Putin-friendly program placed so much focus upon ended up giving the game away. If you look closely, you can see that Putin and Zarubin are opening 2 different, although outwardly very similar doors. On one, the handle is located slightly higher, on the other, slightly lower. Current Time says in its report on the Sistema discovery. One of these offices was a replica. The door handle, in what was later discovered to be Putin's Sochi office, follows the line of the slab joints that are on the adjacent wall. The Novo-Ogaryovo office's handle is slightly below this line. A seam on the wall behind Putin is also noticeably lower than the same seam in the office from which Zarubin reports. There are other giveaways. There are different legs on the TV stands in both offices, along with different numbers of ventilation holes and different writing pads, Current Time adds. All of this is viewable in photographs shared by the outlet, and it's all evidence that mounts to Putin having several offices that he's trying to make look identical. These sorts of discrepancies between offices occur regularly among the 700 reports that Sistema analyzed. One day a new renovation is seen, only for a report published a few days later to feature a different renovation or a return to what we'd seen before the new renovation was completed. A publication named Proect even reported on the duplicate offices back in 2020, leading to the Kremlin issuing an official denial while stating that all claims of duplicates amount to an information attack. Such a furious response shows us that Putin absolutely does not want people to know that he has near-identical offices in several locations. Then there's the third office. Based in Valdai, this is the office in which Putin held meetings related to Russia's Winter Cherry Hotel fire in March 2018. That fire killed at least 64 people, 41 of whom were children in Siberia, and it became a national emergency. Perhaps Putin's fear of the anger from his people for allowing such a tragedy to happen led him to decide to avoid his original office and instead use the Valdai duplicate. But how do we know this fake office wasn't the same one revealed in Sochi? Sistema says more differences separate the Valdai location from its two compatriots. For one, a scene running across the wall behind the office's main table is a touch higher than that seen in both the Novo Ogariovo and Sochi locations. There's also a thermostat switch in the center of the panel near the door at Valdai. In the other two offices, that switch is placed off-center toward the panel's bottom left corner. There are also differences in the colors of the tables in all three offices, and the Valdai location has the same slightly higher door handle as the Sochi office. There's too much evidence mounting up. As much as the Kremlin might deny it, Putin clearly has duplicate offices all around Russia. These three identical offices are just the ones for which there is evidence. United 24 media claims that Putin's penchant for performative office shenanigans started in 2014, which is the same year that Russia annexed Crimea. However, the lying intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic, as Putin wanted his people to believe that he was isolating himself in his Novo Ogariovo office. The footage Sistema examined revealed that he wasn't, as he was more likely in the Sochi or Valdai locations. So you can add breaking his own COVID-19 restrictions to Putin's massive list of crimes. Putin's fake offices have become so important to him that their creation and use are now matters of Russian process. The investigation concludes that the Kremlin's use of cloned offices and false location reporting has become an institutionalized practice, United 24 media reports. This system, Sistema argues, now shapes state logistics and protocol around maintaining the personal security and psychological comfort of the Russian leader. It seems that Putin is regularly bouncing between his three near-identical offices since he launched his Ukraine invasion. The statement about his psychological comfort reveals why. We'll get into that in a moment. If Sistema's report isn't enough to convince you that Putin not only has duplicate offices, but he constantly lies about where he is at any given time, then a report by Pamfletti offers more evidence. On September 13th, it revealed that it had spoken to a man named Gleb Karakulov, once a high-ranking Kremlin official who served as part of Putin's elite personal security service. The 35-year-old Karakulov had defected when Putin invaded Ukraine. Given his role, he would have been attached to Putin's hip for as long as he served, which would give him all of the insight he needed into the Russian leader's paranoid playbook. Karakulov confirmed the existence of Putin's identical offices, claiming that they're part of a web of security systems designed to prevent Putin from being assassinated. He also revealed details that the Sistema report overlooked or thought were irrelevant, such as the fact that Putin keeps all of his duplicate offices as sparsely furnished as possible to minimize the risk of discovery. Each office also has 10 perfectly sharpened pencils that are placed next to a computer screen and keyboard. Plus, each has 3 white telephones on Putin's desk, all stationed to his left, along with a microphone used when Putin is holding conversations. Tellingly, there are no windows in any of the 3 offices. Having a view to the outside would be a clear giveaway that Putin isn't in the office he claims to be in. There were times when I knew he was in Sochi. The TV and the news showed him leading a meeting in Novo Ogariovo, Karakulov tells Pamfletti. So I asked a colleague in Sochi, has he left already? No, he said, he's still here. I think this is an attempt to confuse, firstly, foreign intelligence, and secondly, so there are no assassination attempts, Karakulov concludes. Putin's paranoia goes so deep that he even has his security officials fly planes or send presidential convoys to places that Putin has no intention of visiting. It's all misdirection. But as clever as the plan may seem, small and some might argue, avoidable mistakes have given the game away. As for why Putin is going to such great lengths to conceal his location, Karakulov's comments indicate that Russia's leader is terrified of assassination attempts and foreign agents learning Russia's secrets. However, the Ukraine war has given him another reason to fear for his life. It's a reason that has led to him making 29 of his 30 public appearances at his Valdai clone office rather than the office he's supposed to be working from in Novo Ogariovo between January and September of 2025. And it's also the reason why that Valdai office is reportedly surrounded by 14 air defense systems, including 13 Pantsir missile systems, as United 24 media reports. Putin is terrified of Ukraine's drones, and he has every reason to be. According to United 24 media, one of the main reasons that Putin is now using his Valdai clone office is that it's surrounded by forests. It's a lot easier to conceal air defense systems in the trees than it is to hide them in the urban setting that surrounds the Novo Ogariovo original. Valdai has become one of Russia's most fortified sites specifically because Putin knows that Ukraine has long-range drones that are capable of evading air defenses, as long as the positions of those defenses are known. What this means is that Putin is hiding away at a residence that is situated roughly halfway between Moscow and St. Petersburg, rather than working in his country's capital like practically all other leaders would do. Putin knows that Ukraine would love to take him out with one of its drones, and he knows that Ukraine has the drones to do it. The country's FP-1 long-range drone alone has a range of 1,600 kilometers, according to Militani in a May 2025 report. That amounts to about 994 miles, which is more than enough to place the Novo Ogariovo office at risk. That office's urban location also means that Putin can't easily hide air defenses that can shoot down drones, meaning the position is even more vulnerable. Ukraine has also placed Moscow under drone siege several times since it developed its long-range drone capabilities. The most recent of these sieges came toward the end of October, when Ukraine sent drones into Moscow on 3 consecutive nights, forcing the closure of airports while sending a message to Putin that he will never be safe if he stays in his nation's capital city. Ukraine used these Moscow-focused drones to destroy military and industrial assets, The Guardian said on October 29th. You can guarantee some of those drones would have targeted Putin if he hadn't run away from Russia's most important city. Beyond tricking Ukraine, Putin's fake offices also seem to be an attempt to fool his own people. As far as the average Russian learns from state TV, Putin works from his Novo Ogariovo office. That's Putin's supposed seat of power, and TV stations regularly claiming that this is where he is could be designed to lend a sense of security to a population that Putin is trying to control. Your president is hard at work, these reports are saying, and he's in the same office in which he always operates because he isn't afraid of Ukraine. That's a complete lie. But propagating that lie can feed into the Kremlin's attempts to convince its own people that Ukraine's constant drone strikes in Russian territory aren't as dangerous as they are. If Putin is unafraid of Ukraine, then the Russian people shouldn't be afraid either. And if those people aren't scared of Ukraine, they have no reason to call Putin to end his brutal invasion. Still, it's fear that informs all of the security decisions that Putin makes since he invaded Ukraine. And the duplicate offices in at least 3 locations are just a hint at Putin's paranoia. There are many others, some of which date back to before the Ukraine invasion began. Karakulov, who you'll remember as the former member of Putin's security service, claims that Putin always travels without a device that many of us now consider essential. CBC reports the Russian defector is claiming, "I've never seen him with a mobile phone. All the information he receives is only from people close to him. That is, he lives in a kind of information vacuum." That vacuum can't be helpful to Putin when he's trying to figure out what's happening in Russia or Ukraine. Surrounding himself with lackeys who only tell him what he wants to hear is likely leading Putin to fall out of touch. Other signs of Putin's paranoia are more bombastic than even a series of near-identical offices built to trick people into thinking he's in one location rather than the other. In October 2024, The Independent reported that Putin had made the strange decision to demolish the Bocharov-Ruchi mansion, which is located in Sochi and overlooks the Black Sea. Once one of Putin's favored vacation destinations, the mansion had apparently become a no-go zone for Putin once Ukraine ramped up its drone and missile strikes against Russia's Black Sea fleet. Seemingly fearing for his life, Putin had his beloved palace bulldozed to the ground, presumably to prevent Ukraine from targeting it. Before that demolition, which appears to have happened sometime around May 2024, Putin hadn't visited the holiday home for 7 months before October 2024. Putin once spent 37 days per year at the mansion, often in the company of his secret lover, Alina Kabayeva. Now the mansion is razed and Putin seems to have decided to destroy it before allowing Ukraine to enjoy a propaganda victory by filming one of its drones taking the holiday home out. Some of Putin's security measures make a lot more practical sense. Pamfletti reveals that Putin has been wearing bulletproof vests for every one of his public appearances since at least 2023, per a report by the Moscow Times. That measure was taken on recommendation by Putin's Presidential Security Service, and it makes plenty of sense for a man who appears to believe that everybody is out to get him. The Moscow Times also revealed in the summer of 2024 that Putin's personal security service had been ramped up since Ukraine gained the ability to strike Moscow, The Kremlin takes Vladimir Putin's security very seriously. He is protected by a whole army of visible and invisible guards, one unnamed official told the outlet. Again, all of this makes sense. It certainly seems more practical than creating fake offices and destroying beloved holiday homes. However, Putin's security measures take a sharp turn back toward the bizarre amidst reports that he's so paranoid about anybody finding out anything about him that he took a certain type of suitcase to his August meeting with US President Donald Trump in Alaska, a poop briefcase. Several outlets reported on this strange suitcase, though it must be noted that many were tabloids rather than respected outlets. The Economic Times summed the story up in an August 18th report, where it claimed that Putin is having his security detail mop up and store his excrement in highly guarded suitcases to prevent foreign powers from using his waste to determine what, if any, physical ailments he has. The same outlet says that reporters from the French outlet Paris Match claim that Putin has had this system in place as far back as his 2017 visit to France. He also reportedly uses a portable toilet rather than on-site facilities during his foreign visits, again out of fear that somebody somewhere might learn anything about him thanks to his waste. This last security measure should be taken with a grain of salt, considering the sources. However, it's clear that everything we've discussed in this video paints the picture of Putin as a paranoid maniac who is so terrified of the consequences of his actions in Ukraine that he does everything he can think of to avoid them. For all the power that Putin has, the revelation of his secret clone offices shows us that he is a man who lives every day of his life in fear. And he should, because if he stays in one place too long, Ukraine's drones will come to meet him. On October 26th, the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, began crowing from the rooftops. Russia had encircled the key city of Pokrovsk, he claimed, and 31 Ukrainian battalions were surrounded. It would only be a matter of time before the city fell and Ukraine suffered one of its most damaging defeats since Vladimir Putin's invasion began. Ukraine had until October 27th to leave Pokrovsk or its forces would be destroyed, Gerasimov declared. It's over 2 weeks later and Pokrovsk hasn't fallen yet. Instead, the city is costing Putin everything. As Russia claims to be on the verge of victory, it's suffering massive troop losses that lead to shortages elsewhere on the front lines. Putin wants Pokrovsk at all costs. What he doesn't realize is that he may be sacrificing Russia's chances in Ukraine to get it. On November 12th, the Kyiv Post published a report revealing that Russian soldiers are dying in such massive numbers during the Pokrovsk offensive that the country is running out of troops to send. To solve the problem, the outlet says, Russia is urgently redeploying troops from other areas of Ukraine to make up for the Pokrovsk shortfall. This is a short-sighted move as it opens up opportunities for Ukraine's forces outside of the city to launch counterattacks and retake territory. But that doesn't matter to Putin. He needs to capture Pokrovsk, and he doesn't care about the cost. The intelligence behind the Kyiv Post report comes from the Atesh resistance movement, which took to Telegram to report that it's seen Russian military convoys flooding toward Pokrovsk. Those convoys from other regions of Ukraine are packed with soldiers and equipment. Specifically, these resources are being pulled from the Zaporizhia and Kherson fronts, both of which are now significantly weakened on the Russian end. The Russian army has apparently exhausted both its main forces and operational reserves to continue the offensive, so they're being forced to urgently expose other sections of the front, Atesh claimed in its November 12th Telegram report. It also revealed that Russia is in such a rush to get its transferred soldiers into the combat lines in Pokrovsk that it's skipping a key step once they arrive. Agents from the 506th Motorized Rifle Regiment report that hundreds of troops are arriving at their location every day. New arrivals from other units are immediately sent into the assault, sometimes without even being assigned to the new regiment. On the one hand, this is clearly Putin using his attritional strategy. A constant flood of manpower will eventually break Ukraine's Pokrovsk defenses, no matter how strong those defenses may be. But on the other hand, Putin is showcasing a remarkable lack of foresight as he sends soldiers to almost certain death, even though he needs to hold on to territory in Zaporizhia and Kherson. For many of these soldiers, the journey to Pokrovsk is a one-way trip. They won't be coming back to defend the occupied territories that Putin has just made more vulnerable. United 24 media agrees with this viewpoint, as it quotes an Atesh source claiming that Russia keeps sending fresh forces to certain death. Morale among these new arrivals is extremely low, which is also affecting Putin's Pokrovsk push. Already strained beyond recognition, Russia's military capacity is starting to creak at the seams, and soldiers who may have once been stationed in occupied regions they thought were somewhat safe are being sent to confront Ukraine's drones, artillery, and other fortifications. Putin is weakening Russia elsewhere in Ukraine for a reason. During the week before the Kyiv Post's November 12th report, Russia launched 132 assaults against Pokrovsk alone. That represents a 20% increase over the assault numbers from the week prior, and it shows us that Putin believes that Russia is getting close to completing what he sees as a final push for Pokrovsk. However, these assaults aren't as successful as Russia needs them to be. Despite its claims of encirclement, Russia's forces are being blocked from every attempt they make to capture key buildings and infrastructure in Pokrovsk, the Kyiv Post reports. Ukraine has placed a particular focus on keeping Russia's forces out of high-rise buildings, thus depriving them of strategic vantage points. Russia's forces are getting into Pokrovsk, but once they're in, they're blind. Ukraine is taking advantage of this fact to clear the occupying forces quickly so its defenders are ready for the next waves. As intense as Russia's Pokrovsk assaults have become, those assaults aren't making much progress. Russia is primarily focused on northern Pokrovsk, which is the industrial hub of the city. However, the Kyiv Post says that Ukraine still controls all of the key access routes in the northern region, which is limiting the number of reinforcements that Russia can send. Even when pulling troops from other fronts, Russia is still having to send them into Pokrovsk as part of small units that make very little progress. Russia is also trying to push toward Rashin, which is to the northwest of Pokrovsk, though it's stalling out there as well. Russia is struggling more than many realize in Pokrovsk. It's caught between trying to launch more intense assaults and dealing with a shortage of soldiers for those assaults, which have made it pull from elsewhere in Ukraine. Putin's single-minded focus on taking Pokrovsk at all costs may eventually work, but he'll have bled his military dry in the process. That might still work out for Putin. We'll explain why later in the video. More pressing at the moment is the implication that Russia is running out of soldiers in Pokrovsk, which is forcing it to bring reserves into the region. Bear in mind that Russia has already sent plenty of soldiers to the Pokrovsk front. When Putin launched Russia's vaunted summer offensive in May, he did so with the express goal of taking Pokrovsk by the end of August. So determined was he to reach this goal that he dedicated over 100,000 soldiers to the cause, CNN reported toward the end of June. That's a lot of soldiers, yet Russia clearly needs more. And it's not just the soldiers it had dedicated to other areas of Ukraine that are now being sent to the Pokrovsk meat grinder by Putin. As United 24 media reported on November 12th, Russia is attempting to bulk up its numbers in Ukraine by sending over soldiers that were never meant to be in Ukraine in the first place. Russia is sending draft officers into Ukraine. Specifically, those draft officers are being punished for their failure to hit their recruitment quotas, United 24 media reports. It says that these officials, who are usually officers or sergeants, typically serve in the regions where recruitment is low. The Republic of Sakha, which is also known as Yakutia, is a good example. There, the outlet claims the heads of 7 enlistment offices have been booted to the front lines and are now serving in Russia's 5th, 29th, and 35th armies. This information hasn't been pulled from thin air. United 24 media says that Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, or HUR, has been tracking the movements of these unfortunate recruitment officers, and it's confirmed that Putin is meting out his punishment for their failures to recruit at the numbers that Russia needs. In its announcement about Russia's new approach, it points out that recruitment officers in Yakutia fall below their targets by an average of 40%, explaining why they are among the first to be punished. However, what Putin may see as a punishment is actually an unintended drawing back of the curtain that reveals how dire Russia's manpower situation is. Recruiters are sent to the front lines in areas where there is either not enough male population to meet established standards, or where it's impossible to conduct a recruiting campaign within the established timeframe, HUR states. This indicates the Kremlin's complete unawareness of the state of affairs in the regions under its control and the urgent need to replenish losses. The implication here is that Putin has lost the plot. He's setting unrealistic targets and punishing those assigned to meet those targets when they inevitably fail. Of course, this also means that Putin is sending experienced recruiters to die in Ukraine. Those who replace these punished officers are going to have an even harder time hitting Putin's numbers, leading to them being punished too. And so it will keep going, with Russia sacrificing soldiers who have particular talents once again to the meat assaults in Pokrovsk and elsewhere. There's another interesting wrinkle to this part of the story. The recruiters in line for Putin's punishment typically operate in Russia's far-flung regions. While HUR notes that Putin seems to be losing control of these regions now, they have previously been a massive source of manpower for the Ukraine war. As the Wilson Center noted back in March, Putin prefers to recruit his soldiers from the poorest and most remote regions of Russia. He is disproportionately pulled from the populations of indigenous peoples in Russia, the center claims. And it has the numbers to prove it, using the Buryat community as an example. According to Alexandra Gamazapova, president of the Free Buryatia Foundation, at least 2,470 Buryatia residents have been killed in action since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the outlet claims. In a republic with a population of only 980,000, of which 30% are Buryat, this translates to 252 combat deaths per 100,000 residents. For comparison, the number of Muscovites killed in action is estimated at 1,215. in a city of 13.2 million. This translates to 9.2 combat deaths for 100,000 residents. There's a clear bias at play here. Putin prefers to send the impoverished and the far-flung into Ukraine because doing so means that he keeps the demands of the war he started away from Russia's more important cities. Why does that matter? As the struggles of the recruitment offices in Yakutia prove, Russia's source of impoverished soldiers who can be cajoled or bribed into service with massive contracts is running low. The well is almost dry, and that means Putin will soon have to start recruiting from cities that haven't been impacted by the war anywhere near as much as Russia's poorer regions. Reserves and recruiters being sent to the front lines, along with the failures to hit quotas that led to the punishment of the latter, all show us that Russia's military recruitment situation isn't exactly rosy. Compounding that issue is that Russia's financial situation may also mean the country can't keep pace with its recruiting ambitions. Back in April, the New York Post spoke to George Barros, who is the Russia team lead at the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. Barros revealed that Russia had already burned through about half of its $106 billion in liquid reserves, which it's been using to fund the war. Assuming Russia tries to keep pumping soldiers into Ukraine at a high pace, which the increased assaults in Pokrovsk show that it is, Russia may have only had between 12 and 16 months' worth of money to afford its soldiers back in April. We're in November now. At best, if Barros is correct, Russia only has about a year of funds left. The system for generating fighters worked for 2.5 years, but it's starting to fail, Barros told the New York Post. Russia is constrained by the laws of economics, scarce resources, and there isn't an endless manpower resource in Russia. If Russia is also having to hire soldiers from more prosperous regions of the country than it has in the past, as the falling recruitment numbers in its more remote regions indicate it has to, then Putin may even have to offer more money in soldier contracts than he currently does to get more affluent Russians onto the front lines. Whether it's a manpower or financial shortage, Russia is struggling to get enough people into Pokrovsk. However, as we said earlier, Putin wants Pokrovsk, and he doesn't care how much Russia loses in the process of capturing the city. As RBC Ukraine notes, Russia has already exhausted its main forces and a lot of its operational reserves in the Pokrovsk direction, and that's taken Russia to the verge of capturing the city. Though reports of complete encirclement appear to be premature, CNN said on November 8th that Russia is poised to take Pokrovsk after 21 months of brutal fighting. At this point, it seems to be a case of how much longer Ukraine can hold out, rather than how it will repel Putin's forces entirely. But why? Why is Putin so willing to hurt Russia's positions elsewhere to push through in Pokrovsk? Earlier we mentioned that Putin's approach of trying to take Pokrovsk at all costs might end up working out for him in the end, even with the sheer scale of loss that Russia has experienced. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky reveals why when talking about the situation in Pokrovsk and what it really means in the wider context of the war. On November 7th, Zelensky held a media briefing in which he explained that the push for Pokrovsk has ramifications that extend beyond the city itself, and even the Donetsk region that Putin believes that Russia can take if it captures Pokrovsk. It all comes down to both the peace discussions that have stopped and started throughout 2025, along with Putin's fear of increased US pressure. Putin is trying to promote the narrative that they can allegedly take Donbass and to call on Western countries to force Ukraine to give Donbass to Russia, Zelensky said on November 7th. He added, "It can affect the push for sanctions or the delay of sanctions. Russia is very afraid of strong US decisions, and with this story about Pokrovsk, they want to show success on the battlefield." This idea that Pokrovsk will give Putin leverage is what has led Russia's leader to try to take the city at all costs. And wouldn't you just know it, Putin is trying to play the Pokrovsk card, even though the city hasn't fallen and Russia's troop situation has become dire. On November 12th, Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty reported that the word out of Russia is that Putin is ready to resume peace talks with Ukraine as the battle for Pokrovsk rages. That claim comes in the wake of a backdoor effort by the UK to reopen a dialogue, which fell flat because Russia is unwilling to compromise on any of the demands it's made for peace. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, was quick to reveal that the UK had tried to start a discussion, stating, "There were indeed contacts," but the talks quickly collapsed because there was a lack of any intention or desire to listen to our position. Given the impossibility of exchanging views, the mutual dialogue has not developed. Now Russia is ready to resume talks with Ukraine in Istanbul. For the time being, Kyiv has put the negotiations on pause. Turkish officials have repeatedly called on them to resume those. The Russian team of negotiators is ready for that, and the ball is in Ukraine's court, a senior Russian diplomat told the Russian news agency TASS on November 12th. It's clear to see what's happening here. Putin is confident in success at Pokrovsk, despite Russia's losses, and he thinks he can strike while the iron is hot by putting pressure on Ukraine to acquiesce. But he's wrong for two reasons. The first is that the taking of Pokrovsk may not be as big a coup for Russia as Putin has led the West to believe. The Independent's World Affairs editor Sam Kiley made that point in a November 11th piece. where he pointed out that Russia will take more than a century to capture all of Ukraine if it continues at the pace we've seen so far during the war. And even if Pokrovsk falls, Kiley says, there will be nothing left of the garrison town for Russia to defend or exploit. Beyond that, a veritable hellscape awaits the Russian forces that will attempt to push deeper into Ukraine from Pokrovsk. The landscape behind the Ukrainian front lines has been prepared for a fighting retreat by key forces. Thousands of miles of trenches, barriers, tank traps, and barbed wire mazes have been laid, Kiley writes. No doubt secret minefields, stay-behind bunkers for behind-the-lines operations, and meticulously calibrated targeting will make Russia's next phase another session in the meat grinder of Ukraine's eastern front. Putin sees the capture of Pokrovsk as a potential endpoint, which is why he's throwing everything he has at the city. Ukraine sees that city's fall as the trigger for an even bigger Russian bloodbath in the Donbass. Speaking of bloodbaths, that brings us to the second reason why a Russian capture of Pokrovsk might not mean as much as Putin hopes it will. Should the city fall, the number of soldiers that Russia has lost and will go on to lose in Pokrovsk's capture will come back to haunt it. We're already seeing that with Russia being forced to call on soldiers from elsewhere in occupied Ukraine to maintain its Pokrovsk offensive. However, the scale of loss already experienced in that city can't be underestimated. The Kyiv Post points out that Ukraine exacted a heavy toll on Russia's Pokrovsk forces in the week before the revelation that soldiers are being pulled into the region from elsewhere. The previous 7 days have seen Ukraine kill 236 Russian soldiers and wound a further 136. That's bad enough news in its own right, especially because it shows that Russia is dealing with more deaths than injuries in its push for Pokrovsk. These dead soldiers need to be replaced, both now and when Russia tries to push beyond Pokrovsk into the fortified hellscape that Kiley says awaits them. In addition to these troop losses, Russia has also lost a tank, a trio of armored vehicles, and 23 other vehicles, such as bikes and trucks, over the past 7 days. Taking a wider view of the entirety of 2025, David Axe says in his Trench Arc column that Russia has lost 100,000 soldiers to death or injury in the Pokrovsk direction during the year. That was back on October 6th. Another month of fighting will have added several thousand more to that figure. This is the problem with Putin's approach of taking Pokrovsk at all costs. Yes, it seems inevitable the city will fall, though it may be weeks or even months before that happens. As Ukraine continues to defend, Russia will lose many more soldiers at a time when it's already yanking soldiers from the front lines elsewhere to fight in Pokrovsk. Russian military recruitment is struggling, as we see from the punishments being meted out to recruitment officers who don't meet their quotas. And as he tries to use Pokrovsk as leverage against Ukraine in the West, Putin has failed to answer a key question: what comes after Pokrovsk? Russia may want the West to think that the rest of Donetsk will fall after Pokrovsk, but the reality is that an entire fortified belt of other cities and territories awaits the exhausted and battered Russian forces, assuming those forces can take Pokrovsk. Leverage can't exist when the army that underpins it has been destroyed. Putin may find that out if and when Pokrovsk falls. Tensions are rising between the United States and Venezuela. As the US sends more of its military assets into position off the Venezuelan coast, its opponent is scrambling to find any help it can get its hands on to counter the US threat. Russia has come to Venezuela's aid. And in doing so, it's made a catastrophically dumb decision that has massive ramifications for everything from the Ukraine war to Russia's relationship with the US. What was the insanely stupid thing that Russia just did in Venezuela? It gave Venezuela air defenses. On November 4th, the War Zone, or TWZ, reported that one of Russia's highest-ranking lawmakers has confirmed that Russia has supplied Venezuela with a host of air defenses. Worse yet, that same lawmaker suggested that Moscow could supply ballistic and cruise missiles at some point in the future. For Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, this news is amazing as he deals with a growing threat from US ships near his territory. Those ships are being joined by the American aircraft carrier the USS Gerald R. Ford and its accompanying fleet of destroyers, which were headed across the Atlantic Ocean at the time of TWZ's report. Back to what Venezuela is receiving, the lawmaker in question is the first deputy chairman of Russia's State Duma Defense Committee, Alexei Zuravlev. He has spoken to the Russian outlet Gazeta.ru to provide the details. Russian Pantsir S-1 and Buk M2E systems were just recently delivered to Caracas by Il-76 transport aircraft, Zuravlev told the outlet on November 1st. He also delivered a not-so-subtle threat to the US by suggesting that what he has revealed is far from all that Russia has sent to Maduro. Information about the volumes and exact names of what's being imported from Russia is classified, so the Americans could be in for some surprises, Zuravlev added. I don't see any obstacles to supplying a friendly country with new developments like the Oreshnik or, say, the proven Caliber missile. At least no international obligations restrict Russia from doing so. The message being sent is clear. If the US keeps threatening Venezuela, Russia will provide Maduro with the weapons he needs to neutralize that threat. Whether such a neutralization can actually happen is irrelevant. What is important here is that Russia has laid out its stall and is being very vocal about its support of a country that the US is treating like an enemy. TWZ builds on these statements, noting that there is no visual proof to verify Zhuravlev's claims about Pantsir S-1s heading to Venezuela. However, it's clear that a Russian Ilyushin Il-76 cargo plane arrived in Caracas on October 26th after following a circuitous route, Defense News said, included several stops in countries that are under Putin's sway. These nations include Cuba and Nicaragua. The plane returned to Moscow by way of countries like Algeria, suggesting that it may have picked up cargo to bring back to Russia after delivering its load to Venezuela. These deliveries, assuming they are of what the Russian lawmaker claims them to be, would add to an already strangely varied collection of Venezuelan air defenses. Before Russia's intervention, those defenses were primarily made up of older surface-to-air missile systems that have been upgraded over the years. Now, more modern systems appear to have arrived, and they have the potential to pose a serious threat to any aerial assaults that the US might be considering in Venezuela. And more could be coming. On November 12th, Newsweek noted that Russia and Venezuela signed a strategic partnership agreement in May. That partnership was only ratified in Russia in late October, suggesting that Putin has held off until a situation arises where it might be advantageous for Russia to provide direct support to Venezuela. Regardless, now that the partnership is ratified, Kremlin mouthpieces are coming out of the woodwork to suggest that more aid may be coming to Russia's grateful partners. Beyond Zhuravlev's suggestions that Oreshnik and Kalibr missiles may soon be on their way to Maduro, Newsweek says that the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, has started to become vocal. Russia is ready to fully act within the framework of the obligations that were mutually stipulated in this agreement with our Venezuelan friends, Lavrov said on November 11th. Venezuela has also expressed gratitude for the Russian help it has received thus far. The country's foreign minister, Ivan Gil Pinto, thanked Russia for its firm solidarity for the defense of our sovereignty on November 11th. Plus, Russia's foreign ministry has claimed that it's ready and waiting to respond to any more requests that come from Maduro and his minions in Caracas. What we see here is Russia throwing its weight around. By supporting Venezuela so firmly, Putin is trying to tell the US and perhaps more directly President Donald Trump that Russia is still a threat. Venezuela is essentially a proxy, a nation that Russia is using to move dangerous weapons in the vague proximity of the US. And if the threats of Oreshnik and Kalibr missiles arriving in Venezuela end up being true, Maduro will have weapons that he can use to strike the US on its own soil. On the surface, this looks like a smart power play by Russia. It gets to arm an ally that could be a threat to the US while basically washing its hands of what that ally does with the weapons that Russia is providing. But if you remember what we told you at the beginning of the video, what Russia has just done in Venezuela is far from smart. It's insanely stupid, and as William Spaniel revealed in a November 7th video covering Russia's actions, there are 3 reasons why Putin just made a potentially catastrophic mistake. The first of those reasons relates to the country that has Putin's main focus since February 2022, Ukraine. Spaniel poses the obvious question, asking, what does it say if Putin refers to prioritize Venezuelan air defenses over the next most vulnerable targets in Russia? He has a point. The last few months have been a horror show for Russia when it comes to the scale and effectiveness of Ukraine's long-range strikes on its territory. Ukraine's attack on Russian oil refining alone highlights how effective the country's long-range drones and missiles have become. Energy Newsbeat produced a tally of these refinery strikes in a November 11th article reporting on yet another successful Ukrainian attack. It says that between August and the beginning of November, Ukraine has launched at least 58 attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, with 29 of those attacks targeting refineries. That works out to about 17 or 18 strikes per month, and this constant success tells us something important. Russia's air defenses aren't protecting its refineries well enough. Expanding the scope to all of 2025, Ukraine has completed more than 60 drone strikes on refineries, the same outlet claims. All told, it has hit half of the 38 major refineries in Russia, many of them several times, to cause shutdowns that have led to massive issues inside Russia. As of November 11th, Russia's gasoline production has dropped by 16.3%, with diesel declining by 37.5%, the outlet claims. There has also been a 30.4% drop in refinery throughput as a result of Ukraine's constant attacks. Euronews adds to this, noting on November 3rd that Ukraine's refinery strikes have impacted up to 38% of Russia's refining capacity. Ukraine's drones have also evolved to the point where they can fly for 1,000 kilometers, where they could only once travel 500, the outlet notes. Russia has lost 500,000 barrels of its refining capacity per day, and it's mostly happening due to the drones that cost as little as $55,000 each. We tell you all of this because we're building up to a couple of questions. What does Russia need to make Ukraine's long-range drones less effective? Air defenses. What has it just sent and claims it will continue to send to Venezuela? Air defenses. Russia's latest move is so monumentally stupid because it deprives itself of the very thing that it needs to have a chance of stopping Ukraine's long-range drones. Remember, these drones have already been extremely successful before Russia started sending Buk and Pantsir systems to Venezuela. With even fewer air defense systems at its disposal, Russia is making the key targets that Ukraine keeps hitting even more vulnerable. It's not like Russia's air defense situation is going to magically get better either. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Russia has lost 1,242 anti-aircraft warfare units since Putin launched his invasion. That's a huge chunk of its stockpiles gone, either because the units have been destroyed directly or due to Ukraine taking out the radars that allow those units to detect potential targets. Several analysts have also noted that Russia now has gaping holes throughout its territory that are ripe for exploitation by Ukraine's drones. The Kyiv Independent reported on the opinions of two of those experts in a November 9th article. According to Sasha Bruckman, who is a military analyst with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Russia has lost many air defense systems over the past 2 years, so it's plausible that there are many holes in their coverage that make successful attacks possible. George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War backs that opinion, adding, "Once you get past that initial shell around the theater in Ukraine, the rest of Russia has holes and vulnerabilities." Russia appears to have concentrated the vast majority of the air defenses that it has left that aren't already in occupied Ukraine around the capital city of Moscow. That makes sense. Protect the most valuable city, along with Putin, at all costs. But Russia is a vast country, and its resources are spread all over. By focusing on Moscow and Ukraine, Russia had already weakened itself to the point where Ukraine can carry out devastating drone strikes with seeming impunity. Now, with Russia sending air defense units it could have used to stop Ukraine's drones, even more holes are going to appear. Putin can't be ignorant of this fact, Spaniel says when speaking about how strange Russia's actions in Venezuela are. He points out that the information has to be filtering to Putin. The refinery attacks are publicly observable, Spaniel says. No one in the Kremlin is unsure about whether they are happening. And if you're unsure whether the information is filtering up there, remember that there are plenty of oligarchs who spend plenty of time in the Kremlin that are scared out of their minds about what's happening. They should be. Their pocketbooks are being torched just like their refineries. And Putin's decision to send the very systems that could protect those refineries to Venezuela isn't going to make those oligarchs any happier. That brings us nicely to Spaniel's second reason why Russia has just made an incredibly stupid series of decisions. Putin thinks he has the Russian public locked down, but he shouldn't be so confident. Spaniel points out that Putin seems to be operating under an assumption that at any other time during his reign would probably be correct. It does not matter whether the refineries are getting blown up and gasoline prices are surging, Spaniel says of what appears to be Putin's mindset. The Russian population is no threat to the Kremlin, and the Kremlin only cares about foreign policy, so the Russian people can just deal with it. There's a problem with that line of thinking, and it comes down to the gasoline that Spaniel mentions. Russia subsidizes gasoline prices for its domestic population in what Spaniel calls a sort of social contract that the Kremlin holds with the Russian people. The key mechanism it uses to provide this subsidization is something called damper payments. These payments are made directly to Russia's oil refineries as a means to encourage them to sell their products cheaply to the domestic market rather than chasing the higher prices that international customers are willing to pay. Thanks to these payments, along with a few other mechanisms, Russia's people pay less than they otherwise would for gasoline and diesel. Even as the prices of everything else in the country rise, that social contract helps to keep Russia's people subdued. Putin knows how important this damper payment is. That's why he suspended a reduction in the subsidy in October, with the suspension due to run until May. The problem is that this suspension isn't doing anything to help Russia maintain the social contract with its people that Spaniel mentions. Gasoline prices in particular have rocketed up since Ukraine started its intense refinery campaign, and they show no sign of coming back down. The shortages caused by Ukraine's strikes have pushed wholesale gasoline prices up by between 40% and 50% since the beginning of 2025, the Moscow Times reported on November 4th. Russia's refining output is also uncoincidentally 14% lower than it was before the Ukraine war, and is now at its lowest point since 2019. All of this links back to Russia's failure to halt Ukraine's refinery strikes. The damper payments aren't working anymore because they don't alter the fact that refineries are running out of gasoline that they can sell. Prices are still going up because of these supply issues, and those supply issues may not exist at the level that they do if Russia weren't so stretched on the air defense front. Again, sending air defenses to Venezuela at the point where the social contract Spaniel mentions has been broken could be enough to push what Putin views as a controlled Russian population over the edge. There is no guarantee. Russian authorities aren't shy about shutting down public protests, often with violence and prison sentences. However, Spaniel draws a comparison to Russia's fall 2022 partial mobilization for Ukraine to make a point about how Putin may be underestimating the strength of potential public reaction to the implications of Russia's decision to aid Venezuela with air defenses that Russia really needs. There hasn't been another mobilization since 2022, at least not officially. People are being mobilized, says the new Eurasian Strategy Center, but the Kremlin is achieving that mobilization by offering huge contracts to its soldiers. When the money runs out, the mobilization bogeyman that angered so many Russians in 2022 will have to come back around. That would spark a backlash. And the comparison that Spaniel draws appears to imply that we could see a similar sort of backlash start if Russia doesn't find a solution for its fuel crisis. That solution definitely doesn't seem to be send the one type of weapon that might be able to defend against Ukraine's drones to another country. By the way, Russia's fuel issues also affect its soldiers in Ukraine. They're not getting the gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel they need for their assaults, and they're dying because of it. Perhaps that's why some Russian generals are calling for Putin's head. According to an October piece by the National Security Journal, many of Russia's active duty generals and senior officials find themselves on a collision course with Putin over the consequences of his terrible military decision. One of their concerns is that Putin is obstinately clinging to the same set of maximalist demands he had since day one of the war, the journal claims. The lack of any admission of his mistakes or changes in strategy to adjust to the new realities on the battlefield troubles them. Despite the high casualties and other staggering losses, Putin's core objectives remain unchanged. Sending much-needed air defenses to Venezuela is just the latest in a litany of mistakes that Putin has made since he invaded Ukraine. Perhaps a combination of angered generals and a Russian public furious about a broken social contract could be the reward that the Kremlin reaps for its decision. That brings us to the third and final reason why Putin's decision to arm Venezuela is so stupid. It will inevitably anger Trump. Spaniel believes that Putin has just taken this step because he believes that the things that the US is doing around Venezuela aren't a complete bluff. The Kremlin likely doesn't believe that a war will happen, Spaniel is quick to add, but Putin is nervous that the US is threatening one of its proxies. What Putin is doing with this transfer of air defenses is attempting to give Venezuela more leverage if and when negotiations start. In crisis bargaining, the deals made to avoid war must be commensurate with the balance of power, Spaniel says. So the more power Venezuela has, the better it will do either in terms of a negotiated settlement or an expected war outcome. Weapons, then, are as useful in achieving a coercive peace as they are for waging war, Spaniel concludes. In other words, Putin is trying to get in the way of Trump throwing America's weight around. And for a man who prides himself on the art of the deal, a third party getting involved in his military-led negotiation efforts isn't going to go over well. Trump is already very frustrated with Putin. Months of attempting to bring peace to Ukraine have seen Trump get led down the garden path by Putin on more than one occasion. Russia's leader will tell Trump that he wants peace, only to continue bombing Ukraine while making no effort to actually achieve peace. Recent weeks have seen Trump become very public about how frustrated he is with Putin. On October 22nd, Trump called off a planned meeting with Putin in Budapest, with Trump declaring, "I don't want to have a wasted meeting. I don't want to have a waste of time, so we'll see what happens." Translation, Trump didn't think that Putin would be serious about anything he said during that meeting, so why bother holding it at all? This outward expression of frustration signaled a move that Trump had threatened for months. Just a day after the Budapest meeting was cancelled, Politico reported that Trump had implemented new sanctions that targeted two of Russia's major oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Russia was left stunned by a move that could cost the country billions of dollars. Now it seems that Trump has turned his back on Putin altogether, leading to a more adversarial relationship between the two than we've seen at any point since Trump began his second term as US president. Russia sending weapons to Venezuela isn't going to improve that relationship. And with Trump so angry at Putin, Russia will also find itself continuing to fight a war of attrition that has killed or injured over 1.15 million of its soldiers and is now devastating its energy industry. After all, Trump isn't going to submit to Putin's maximalist demands for peace when Russia is actively aiding a country that the US has designated an enemy. Putin needs Trump on his side if he's going to get what he wants out of Ukraine without Russia paying an even heavier price in blood than it's already paid.
Prior to 2022, Ukraine would not have been one of the first countries that came to mind when talking about major military superpowers. Now, it's known around the globe for its extraordinary army, groundbreaking military equipment, and rapidly evolving domestic defense industry. Nobody saw this coming, not even NATO. The alliance has been quite simply stunned by Ukraine's staggering surge, and Kyiv's rise up the military rankings isn't over yet. With every passing day, it's growing stronger, breaking new boundaries, setting new records, and proving itself to be one of the most dynamic, adaptable, and innovative military forces the world has ever seen. Nowhere is Ukraine's military evolution more evident than in the field of drone warfare. While many countries, including some of the world's top military superpowers, are still getting to grips with the basics of building, deploying, and using drones on the battlefield for the likes of reconnaissance and strike missions, Ukraine is light years ahead of them. In less than 4 years since the war began, it has transformed from a drone novice to a master, setting an example to other nations around the world and even outperforming Russia when it comes to the shrewd and strategic use of unmanned aerial and maritime vehicles to deal damage to its opponent. How did it manage all this? Well, the simple answer is that it didn't have a choice. As the war gradually transitioned from a more conventional conflict involving tanks, trenches, and mechanized brigades to one much more heavily dominated by aerial bombardments, drone swarms, and missile salvos, Ukraine had to learn and adapt rapidly if it wanted any hope of survival. Russia first sent dozens, then hundreds of drones its way on a nightly basis, targeting both military and civilian infrastructure with ruthless, relentless intensity. Even some of the strongest militaries on the planet would have struggled to fend off such heavy attacks, especially as many have little to no experience of fighting either with or against drones in any great numbers. On paper, Ukraine too could have crumbled under the pressure. But it didn't. As on so many other occasions throughout this war, its forces dug deep and defied the odds. Facing the threat of losing its territories to the Russians and seeing countless innocent people killed along the way, the country did what it does best. It adapted. It looked at what Russia was doing and tried to do better, with dozens of defense companies, big and small, all across Ukraine, doing whatever they could to enhance the country's drone capabilities. Some of them simply worked on modifying rudimentary quadcopters so that they could carry out recon and assault missions. Others built brand new drones from scratch. Some even attempted far greater challenges, like converting commercial ultralight aircraft into unmanned kamikaze bombers. Bit by bit, their efforts added up, all the way to today, when Ukraine is now considered the #1 name in drone production and innovation. It's not only managed to produce some of the most effective, efficient, and advanced drones currently in operation, but it has put those drones to the test, using them to carry out countless devastating attacks on Russian forces in the occupied territories of Ukraine and even deeper into Russia itself, wiping out everything from airfields and military production plants to oil refineries and fuel depots. In many ways, it's thanks to Ukraine's remarkable mastery of drone technology that the war is still going, as Kyiv may very well have capitulated by now if it weren't for its strategic swarms and world-leading drone operators fortifying its defensive lines and pushing the Russians back time and time again. Drones may even prove to be the X factor that wins the war for Ukraine in the end. For that to happen, it's going to need a lot of them. Fortunately, that shouldn't be a problem. A recent report from Bloomberg revealed the mind-blowing statistic that Ukraine currently produces about 4 million unmanned aerial vehicles every year. That includes everything from the relatively cheap and simple first-person view (FPV) drones that pilots operate with the aid of attached onboard cameras, to far more advanced and capable long-range strike drones, the kind that Kyiv regularly deploys deep behind enemy lines to blow up pipelines and start fires at Russian arms factories. To understand how big that 4 million figure truly is, here's a direct comparison. The United States, which is, by almost any metric, the strongest and most advanced military force in the world, makes just 100,000 drones a year. So, for every American drone that rolls off the production lines, Ukraine makes 40. And quantity isn't the only impressive aspect of the Ukrainian defense industry. As RAND analyst Michael Bonut notes, Kyiv also boasts a rich range of drone types. It's not just the quantity of drones, it's the variety, probably more than all NATO countries combined right now. Indeed, while Russia's army focuses quite heavily on the Shahed-type drones, which originated in Iran, but are now produced en masse on Russian soil, Ukraine has opted for a more dynamic and diverse drone army to continually catch its enemy by surprise. Now, back in the early days of the conflict, for example, we saw the Ukrainian armed forces make the most of the Chinese-built Mugin 5 or Sky-Eye 5000 drones, which were used in the August 2022 attacks on Russia's Black Sea Fleet base in Sevastopol, Crimea. There have also been reports of Ukraine using the UJ-22 Airborne, a single-engine drone capable of carrying either an internal warhead or multiple air-dropped bombs, boasting a range of up to 500 miles, 800 kilometers, as well as the Morok, which can travel distances of up to 186 miles, 300 kilometers, while carrying a warhead of approximately 6.6 pounds, 3 kilograms. Ukraine's forces have also deployed the likes of the jet-powered UJ-25 Skyline, the long-range UJ-26 Beaver, which has been used in attacks on Moscow and other regions around Russia, and the AQ-400 Scythe, which started life as a simple volunteer program, but has since entered serial production and rolled into service with the country's armed forces. There are many more examples of different types of drones, some big, some small, some designed for surveillance and intelligence gathering, others made to drop bombs or even carry out kamikaze nosedives into enemy tanks, fortifications, and troop concentrations. Each is different, and some have naturally proven more successful than others. Some have even been tested, used on a short-term basis, then phased out as their utility declined, while others have become mainstays of Kyiv's aerial arsenal, used day in and day out for attacks along the front lines and beyond. Ukraine has even wowed the world by taking drones out of the air and onto the water, producing the likes of the Magura multi-purpose unmanned surface vehicles, capable of everything from recon and surveillance to patrolling, search and rescue missions, maritime security, mine counter-operations and combat missions too. A Magura was famously involved in one of the most iconic events of the war so far, when it became the world's first sea drone to take out an enemy aircraft, sending one of Russia's $50 million Su-30 fighters spiraling out of the sky after a direct missile strike. Ukraine's varied range of drones unlocks all sorts of offensive capabilities. It can use smaller, cheaper drones in large quantities in dangerous areas along the front lines, for example, knowing that some will be destroyed, but others may find a way through enemy defenses to strike high-value targets. It can use its maritime drones out on the Black Sea and other bodies of water to keep Russia's warships and frigates at bay, or attack its ports, or deploy its more dangerous and explosive long-range drones to damage the biggest and most reinforced targets, hundreds of miles from Ukrainian borders. Another huge advantage for Ukraine, in having created so many drones and reached the point where it can make them in such massive quantities, is that this opens up a whole host of exciting trade opportunities for the country's ever-growing number of defense companies. Indeed, many NATO nations across Europe and other countries around the world are already showing active interest in partnering with some of these Ukrainian firms, investing in their products or teaming up with them to open additional research, development, and manufacturing facilities on their own territories. And Ukrainian drone pioneers like Alexander Krakov are spearheading this bold new stage of the country's military development. Krakov was born in Ukraine but sent from Kiev to the frosty and inhospitable lands of Russia's Siberia as a child, as his father was frightened about the fallout from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Now aged 47, Krakov, who studied as an engineer earlier in life, owns and operates his own Ukrainian drone company called TSIR. He was also one of the first entrepreneurs in the Ukrainian drone industry to seek NATO partnerships and is setting an example for others to follow, sharing technology with European partners to both strengthen the continent's defenses and raise much-needed funds for Kyiv's frontline forces. Krakov's company is currently in the process of setting up a new tactical drone production plant in Finland, which should help to provide a steady supply of additional drones for Ukrainian brigades, while also providing TSIR with access to Western funds and other resources. The drones produced at the plant will primarily consist of quadcopters that are capable of flying up to 9 miles, 15 kilometers for short-range reconnaissance and frontline strike missions, and a Finnish company named Suma Defence plc is also involved in production. This project is a win-win for all concerned. The Finnish defense company gets to learn firsthand from some of the best drone makers on the planet, and it can use that experience moving forward to help Finland explore and enhance its own offensive drone capabilities, which will be vital if ever this country, like Ukraine, has to fend off a future Russian invasion. Given that Finland shares around 830 miles, 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia, it could very well be one of the Kremlin's next targets, especially if rumors and reports of Vladimir Putin planning an attack on one or more NATO nations are true. Working with Ukraine, therefore, is so important for countries like Finland. It will deepen their knowledge of drone warfare and help them better prepare for every eventuality, including the possibility of Russian drone swarms heading over their borders and towards their towns and cities. The Ukrainian drone company, meanwhile, also benefits from this agreement enormously. Having a drone production plant on NATO soil is invaluable, because unless the Kremlin wants to kick off World War III, it can't really do anything to stop TSIR making its drones in Finland. It's not able to launch swarms of Shaheeds or salvos of ballistic miles over the Finnish border, so simply has to watch and wait as the plant churns out hundreds, if not thousands more drones to add to the Ukrainian ranks, knowing that each one has the potential to end a Russian soldier's life or blow up a valuable asset, like a tank or armoured vehicle. Working with the Finnish company also helps Ukraine's drone makers start to build a network of connections beyond their borders and into the NATO alliance. This could lead to additional partnerships with other companies in other countries, and before long, many more of Ukraine's defense firms could have bases of operations in places like Scandinavia, the Baltics, Poland, and beyond. Plus, Summa Defence is financing production and development of the drones themselves. It's even worked on no fewer than 3 prototype models of its own that are now said to be ready to enter serial production after undergoing field testing in Ukraine, according to the company's CEO, Jussi Holopainen, who also stated, "Most companies want to develop drones starting with the initial concept, but we're jumping on a moving train. We're getting information about what systems work in a real war. There's both tech transfer and real-time data about what's happening." Some of the drones being made at the Finnish plant will end up being dispatched to other NATO nations, but many will head straight to Ukraine, giving Kyiv even more options to take the fight to the Russians. This project is just one part of a much larger scheme called Flywell, composed of a consortium of Ukrainian drone manufacturers that make air, sea and land systems capable of targeting Russian assets up to 1,243 miles or 2,000 kilometers away from their launch locations. The consortium intends to raise a whopping $50 million in order to expand its production capacities across Europe, as well as for funding new innovations and technologies in the field of drone warfare, like hydrogen-powered drones, which should be capable of significantly longer flight times than battery-powered models. Flywell firms also make literally hundreds of thousands of drones each year, operating very differently to their counterparts across Europe, who largely tend to produce much smaller quantities of much more expensive systems, which simply wouldn't be feasible in the kind of war that Ukraine is fighting. It's much more effective, on the whole, to have drones that are relatively affordable and easy to make in mass quantities, rather than drones that cost huge amounts to make and therefore could not be deployed in sizable swarms. In other words, much of Europe still has a lot to learn about drone warfare, and Ukraine is the ultimate pool of knowledge as far as that particular topic is concerned. It has to withstand Russian drone strikes on a regular basis, which can sometimes involve up to or over 800 drones crossing the country's borders in the span of a single night. Somehow, through its extraordinary air defense complex, Ukraine is able to take out about 80% of those drones on a consistent basis. Many countries in Europe, even those that are doing their very best to modernize their militaries and prepare for a possible war with Russia, would struggle to achieve anything close to that sort of success rate for the time being. Indeed, when around 20 drones crossed over the Polish border in September, the world got a first-hand look at how ill-prepared NATO nations actually were to deal with them. Poland's Air Force and other NATO nations scrambled several fighter jets to target and take out the drones, but only managed to down 4 of them. One of the fighters also inadvertently launched a missile at a nearby residential building, damaging the roof, but thankfully causing no casualties. It was a chaotic and relatively meagre response to what was only a very small Russian swarm, compared to those that enter Ukraine each night, and it made many in Ukraine and elsewhere worry for Europe's future, with Krakow stating shooting down 4 drones in a night would be a poor result for a single Ukrainian air defense team. Krakow also estimated that NATO nations probably spent more on their jets' fuel responding to the drones than Russia did to make them, and he worries that European countries aren't adapting fast enough and truly learning the lessons Ukraine is trying to teach them. Even in Ukraine itself, drones are the leading cause of civilian deaths and injuries today, and those numbers have tragically risen throughout 2025 as Russia's swarms get bigger and its attacks intensify. If other countries had to deal with those same sorts of swarms and strikes, Krakow and others like him are understandably fearful of how quickly the situation could spiral and how big the death tolls could become. Fortunately, many NATO nations have shown that they are more than willing to learn from Ukraine and eager to engage with the country's defense contractors. The UK, for example, recently announced that it is teaming up with Ukraine on a project to begin joint production of interceptor drones that will help Ukraine's forces combat the vast swarms of Russian Shaheeds that cross their borders and enter their territories each night. The project, codenamed Octopus, is currently in the negotiation stage, but should be implemented at some stage in the coming months, according to Britain's Minister of State for Defence Readiness and Industry, Luke Pollard, who told Bloomberg, "Very shortly we'll be producing around 2,000 drones a month, deliberately shipping all of them to Ukraine so they can be used to intercept Russian drones." The minister went on to explain that drone production will be situated in the UK to begin with, but could evolve to other locations as needed to ensure that Ukraine's battlefield needs are met. UK is outstanding at R&D and advanced manufacture, so we can add something that our Ukrainian friends don't have in this respect. We need to be fast, and we need to be first. Several other nations around Europe are already either negotiating agreements or already in the process of working side by side with Ukrainian drone manufacturers. Slovakia, for example, officially partnered with Ukrainian lightweight surveillance drone manufacturer Skyton back in 2024. Skyton, which produces the Raybird drone capable of travelling an astonishing 1,553 miles, or 2,500 kilometres, and flying for up to 28 hours in total, managed to collect over €10 million, $11.6 million in foreign funding to build its Slovak plant, and originally decided to open an international facility out of fears that its Ukrainian factories would be seen as high-priority targets for Russia, according to the company's founder, Alexander Stopora. The company has also announced partnerships with both the UK and Denmark, and Stopora acknowledges that working in Europe brings both ups and downs. Producing in Europe gives Skyton access to global and NATO markets, but comes with higher costs and stricter regulations. Ukrainian engineers tend to implement upgrades faster than their European counterparts because they work closer to the end users. Firepoint is yet another Ukrainian defense company benefiting from European interest and investment. Denmark has set aside 500 million kroner, $77 million to help the company, which is the brand behind the exciting new Flamingo long-range missile, set up operations on Danish soil. Like Skyton, Firepoint hopes that building a plant on NATO soil will keep its operations safe from Russian attacks, and all output from the facility will go straight back into Ukraine to fuel the war effort. And there are hundreds more drone companies that could benefit from this sort of support in the weeks and months to come. As Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Mikhailo Fedorov notes, in 2022, Ukraine had 10 drone producers. Now there are 500. When the war finally ends, those hundreds of companies are likely to receive near endless offers, deals and proposals from other companies around the world, eager to invest in their products and learn from their experiences, no doubt providing a big boon to Ukraine's post-war economy. In the meantime, they'll keep on doing what they do best, producing the many varied unmanned aerial vehicles that are helping Ukraine win this war. Learn more about the awesome power of Ukrainian drones in this video, which looks at how one of Kyiv's recent deep strikes crippled the Kremlin's oil industry even further. Or to see a different aspect of Ukraine's offensive capabilities, watch this video, which looks at how Kyiv's forces are using advanced electronic warfare systems to wipe out Russian missiles without even needing to fire a single shot. Be sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay informed and up to date on all the latest big breaking news from the military world.